Hi, my name is Jennifer Zielinski, and for the next few minutes, I'm going to give you an overview of my experiences in multidisciplinary studies, as well as my experiences in taking my minor in nonprofit management. I started going back to school about 7 years ago when I decided I wanted to pursue something completely different. Prior to that, I was a stay-at-home mom for about 7 years. And prior to that, I worked in a salon as an esthetician. We've now been here in Idaho for about 13 years, a little over 13 years. So half of that time was spent going to school and working full time. And the other half of that time, I was home with my older kids. And so transitioning to school and full-time work was definitely a challenge and a struggle for me. But what I did was I started off at CWI. And once I started there, it was at least a slower transition for me. It wasn't in your face and it wasn't aggressive. But ultimately, I had decided at that time to set some personal goals. And one was I was going to graduate in 2016. And once I received my AA at CWI, transferred to Boise State University, and that I had discovered the multidisciplinary studies program. That was a program I was unfamiliar with, but at the time I was extremely frustrated with the amount of time and commitment that it would take for me to major in some of the other majors I was pursuing, which would be either psychology or sociology or even social work. And still at that time, I decided I was going to be able to graduate by 2016. But because of kind of a change of events in our family, my older kids at the time were 9 and 7, and we had decided to foster and adopt a local little girl from Boise, the foster care system. And she came to us with some very severe environmental and genetic, mental, and behavioral health disorders. And so it didn't take me long to jump into more of the disability community and really pursue advocacy efforts regarding children's mental health. And so then I started to pursue more of the nonprofit arena, and which would be in addition to a lot of volunteer advocacy efforts. Something that I did set as I jumped into the multidisciplinary studies program, I set a personal goal to be flexible. I was starting to become frustrated in the 2016 graduation goal and all of the sacrifices that I was having to make for my family, and then some of the things that were affecting my full-time work and advocacy efforts. I definitely had to set a goal that would allow me to be flexible. And so if some of those timelines, those events, or some of the courses that I needed to take would take longer, then that was going to be okay. And focusing on my overall goal is definitely what got me through, and that overall goal was to become a director of a nonprofit organization. It seems like a natural transition for me in all of the learned skills and kind of the process to management throughout the past 7 years just seems to be the overall goal for me, and that focus is what keeps me going, allowed me to really continue and pursue the process of my education. So what I also wanted to do was focus on allowing for an extension to my timeline. That was important to me because once I realized that I wouldn't be graduating in 2016, I didn't want that to become a barrier to continuing to pursue my education. And so I made it clear that through the timeline of events that we were setting through the multidisciplinary studies program, that I was going to allow that to be flexible. So a couple of things through this process, I identified multidisciplinary studies as probably the best fit for me, in that not only was it flexible, I could take most of those courses online. The courses I had to take in person would be on the weekends or in the evenings, and I was able to make those commitments, even though it interfered with my personal and my family life. It was definitely a sacrifice, but I was able to do it. It did not affect my current work. And at that time, I was the parent education coordinator with a nonprofit organization, and then transitioned to a program coordinator, and then ultimately the goal would be to become a director of a nonprofit. So with my minor in nonprofit management, I loved that I could handpick those courses, as did I with the multidisciplinary studies. But the handpicked courses for nonprofit management tied right into my personal and my professional goals. So those where I wanted to maybe improve on my grant writing skills, or conflict management, where I really struggled to be able to address and want to resolve conflict, where I would more so just hide or maybe avoid it. So by focusing on the nonprofit management classes that I could handpick, they were tailored directly to both personal and professional. So my favorite classes were not just nonprofit management, but would include human resources, globalization, the leadership skills and the volunteer management, love ethics, but globalization would probably be able to, it most helped me become much more aware of some of the global efforts and some of the global issues and the impacts, and and then being able to either address them here or pursuing efforts beyond just Idaho. Some of the barriers that I've dealt with, I thought this was really important for me to touch on this, because oftentimes within the workplace, or especially in college, these are not necessarily things that most people take in consideration. The everyday barriers would just be what most people deal with, and that would potentially be the full-time job, having a spouse in my case, and then 4 kids. But in addition to that, a lot of personal health issues, and those the onset of some of those issues started about 10, 11 years ago, but I would say within the past 5 years, being very critical to my everyday quality of life. And so dealing with connective tissue disease, POTS being postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, has impacted my heart. Not only damaged it, but it causes excessive low blood pressure, at the same time excessive high heart rate. So oftentimes I would just pass out, or it would completely affect me cognitively. So a lot of memory loss. I would have slurred speech. I would forget the things that I was doing. Sometimes when I was driving, I would forget where I was going. It's really been a huge adjustment for me. And then beyond that, Alport syndrome, a newer diagnosis, but I've been dealing with some kidney issues for the past few years, now recognizing the cause being a genetic syndrome called Alport syndrome, which has really impacted my quality of life as well, in that I'm at stage 3 kidney disease, or kidney failure. So having to work through these, and unfortunately, this just being the beginning of my health issues, where I think they've only scratched the surface. So beyond that, where I've honestly worked tremendously hard to not allow it to impact my work, definitely doesn't impact my daily work, unless, of course, there are times where I need an accommodation. And hasn't excessively affected my education, although maybe in the areas where I would normally be able to give 100%, I wasn't, because of the impact on my health. Maybe during that time, if there were certain flare-ups, or maybe working through medication changes, or even doctor's appointments. And in addition to that, about 7 years ago when I started school, my older child, who is now 21 years old and in college, had some unidentified health issues. We later found out they were kidney issues and most likely the same genetic syndrome. And then my second born, who's now 18, she suffered a traumatic brain injury from a cheer fall about 5 years ago, or 4.5 years ago, and is now, she's at Boise State University, but in the pre-med program, or at least was in the pre-med program, and they switched that over, but studying neuroscience and wants to be a brain surgeon. But that was definitely years and years of crisis and really pursuing specific accommodations in the school environment as well as in the workplace. And then our third, who is now 12, was adopted, like I said, with severe mental and behavioral health disorders, really impacted our family. Rage and aggression and early onset of psychosis. The impact created secondary trauma and not just post-traumatic stress disorder for my husband and I, but definitely secondary trauma to our other 3 kids. Because at the time that I started back into school, I got pregnant. And the reason we adopted was because I was told I could no longer have kids. And so though she is definitely a miracle baby, we were prepared for 4 kids. So through this process, I would say all of these things during the time that I am pursuing my bachelor's degree. And though it would seem simple to achieve, these barriers were definitely, they had an impact. They created a longer timeline. There were the need for some accommodations that I just simply didn't reach out and ask for. But here I am, so 7 years later, and finally at the end of my journey. So I started at Idaho Parents Unlimited, and that was about 7 years ago when I went back to school. And during that time, I just started off as the parent education coordinator, and then there was a natural process in really pursuing moving up the chain, and so there was a created position for me, program coordinator, and then I would just coordinate all programs within the organization as well as coordinate staff in fulfilling those program goals and objectives. And Idaho Parents Unlimited, they are the statewide parent training and information center, as well as the family to family health information center. So we assisted families statewide in special education and related services, as well as anything health related. So in addition to that, for the past 7 years, I've also been a part of all of these committees and work groups. So currently I'm the chair of the Consortium of Idahoans with Disabilities, and like I said, for these past few years, I've sat on the early childhood committees, regions 3 and 4. I was personally appointed by Superintendent Sherry Barrett to sit on the Parent Advisory Committee, Idaho Employment First Consortium, working with adults with disabilities transitioning to the employment sector, and School-Based Medicaid Advisory Committee, where the State Department of Education as well as Idaho Medicaid come together and work on improvements within school-based Medicaid billable services. Optum Idaho, their member advisory committee is comprised of individuals across the spectrum. I would take on a professional role, though I would also bring the parent perspective to the table. The Family to Family Advisory Committee would be Idaho Parents Unlimited's committee, Medicaid Access Committee, where we talk about access to Medicaid for all individuals, and so on. The Reactive Attachment Disorder Work Group is something that I pursued with Child Protective Services, being that my daughter has reactive attachment disorder. It is very misunderstood and creates a lot of conflict within the school environment, especially regarding false accusations, misunderstanding, and where a lot of families are faced with child protective service issues. And so in order to kind of combat that issue, I then just pursued quarterly meetings with Child Protective Services through Child Welfare in order to really dissect and work on improving those systems so that families who are actually in crisis would be able to access mental health services rather than more of that punitive process where their child's removed, put in foster care, and then have to jump through these ridiculous hoops in order to get their child back, when really they just need mental health services. And then now I've been appointed by the governor's office to be on the Human Trafficking Task Force, which I will get into next. So Idaho Anti-Trafficking Coalition is a fairly new coalition. One that I just kind of fell into from attending just one of their monthly meetings. They'd maybe been about 5 months old. They're comprised of a variety of community partners. One would be St. Alphonsus Regional Center. They're the statewide hospital. They are one of the members, as well as Children's Mental Health. We have the Idaho Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health. We have other nonprofits. We have just individuals who want to participate. We have law enforcement, and we have some school personnel and students, and we have survivors and then parents of survivors. One of my biggest barriers, probably the one that almost prevented me from continuing on with my bachelor's degree, is just math. And so being able to, I think this last semester, having to get a tutor, she not only is somewhat of a personal friend, but is a highly respectable figure in the community, especially within advocacy and policy and legislation. And so not only was she able to mentor me and really work through math, but we were able to bond through just our other efforts. And so somehow I was able to find a connection there, which kept me going and kept me motivated. But I would say this would be the ultimate barrier beyond any other barrier to graduating. And as of today, I just took my last math exam and have now passed that class with an 82%.